Hey, my name is Travis Holt. I'm 29 years old, and until 3 months ago, I hadn't set foot in Cedar Hollow, Georgia in 11 years. I'm filling in as the high school biology teacher this year, which in a town this small basically just means I teach biology. I also have a 7-year-old daughter named Sadie, and a house I haven't decided whether to keep. The first day of second grade, I picked Sadie up at 3:15 from the Horseshoe Drive in front of Cedar Hollow Elementary, same as every other exhausted parent in a minivan or a pickup with a booster seat wedged in the back. Sadie climbed in, still wearing her backpack, both straps, the way she insists on wearing it, even though I've told her 100 times to take it off before she sits down. She had a drawing of the solar system taped to the front of her folder, and a gap where her top tooth used to be, and she started talking before I'd even pulled forward in line. My teacher's really nice. Her name is Miss Sutton, and she has a plant on her desk named Steve, and she let me pass out the pencils because I asked first instead of grabbing. That's great, Bug. I checked my mirror, eased the truck forward 6 feet, stopped again. Pickup at Cedar Hollow Elementary moved like a glacier with somewhere to be. She asked my last name during attendance, and I said Holt, and she got kind of quiet. Sadie reported this the way she reported everything, like a fact rather than a moment she'd noticed carried weight. Then at recess she called me over and asked if my dad's name was Travis. I don't remember my foot finding the brake. I remember the truck already stopped, and the horn behind me a half-second later, and my hands still on the wheel like they belonged to somebody who was still driving. She said that, not a question. I already knew the answer was going to rearrange something in my chest before I finished asking it. Yeah, I said yes, and she got quiet again, and then she smiled, but it was a weird smile, and she said, "Tell your dad Brooke says hello." I don't know how long I sat there before the truck behind me leaned on the horn again, long enough that Sadie twisted around in her booster seat and asked if we were being rude by blocking the line, long enough that the name had already dropped through 11 years of my life like a stone through still water, and I was still waiting to hear where it landed. Brooke. I hadn't let myself say that name out loud, not even to myself, in longer than Sadie had been alive. And now my daughter had spent 6 hours in a classroom with her, had colored with markers borrowed from her desk, had passed out pencils because a woman I left without saying goodbye 11 years ago told her that was a kind thing to do. "Are we in trouble?" Sadie asked, once the truck behind us finally swung into the other lane with a look I didn't need to see to picture. "No, Bug, sorry, just thinking." I pulled forward, turned out of the lot onto Route 9, and drove the rest of the way home on a road I'd known since I was younger than she is now, not really seeing any of it. She told me about a boy named Wyatt who ate paste, and a girl who cried during the fire drill, and how Miss Sutton's reading corner had actual pillows, real ones, not the flat kind. I said aha and no way, and that's wild in what I hoped were the right places. By the time we turned into the driveway of my mother's house, the house I still couldn't call mine out loud, I'd apparently agreed to let her get a hamster and told her recess lasted 4 hours, neither of which I meant to say. "Dad." She was already out of her booster, one shoulder dragged down by the backpack. "You didn't hear anything I said for the last part." "I heard you." "I hadn't. Go wash up, I'll start dinner." She went inside. I sat in the driveway a while longer, engine ticking as it cooled, looking at a house I'd spent my whole childhood planning to leave, and I thought about a girl who used to wait for me on the church steps 2 streets over with a paperback and a bag of sour candy, and how she was apparently now spending her days 40 feet from my daughter, and I had no idea what to do with that except sit very still and let it move through me like weather. That night, after Sadie was asleep with the hamster negotiation tabled but not closed, I went out to the garage instead of going to bed, because sleep clearly wasn't happening, and because there was a box out there I hadn't opened since I carried it in from my mother's storage unit 3 months earlier. It was easy enough to find. Same water stain in the corner. Same masking tape label in my mother's handwriting. Travis, high school. I hadn't opened it because I already knew. The way you know a bruise is going to hurt before you press it. Exactly what was inside. A yearbook. A church bulletin from a funeral I'd missed. A concert flyer for a band that broke up before I graduated. And near the bottom, held together by a rubber band gone brittle enough to snap the second I touched it, a stack of notebook paper folded into small, careful squares, the kind you pass under a desk so a teacher doesn't see. I hadn't said her name out loud in years, not even to Peg, who never asked twice about anything I clearly didn't want to talk about. But I still remembered the exact slant of her handwriting on the outside of every one of those folded squares. 3 letters and a heart she stopped drawing sometime in junior year because she said it was beneath us both. I sat on the concrete floor of my mother's garage at 11 o'clock at night, reading notes a 17-year-old girl had passed me under a desk more than a decade ago, like they might explain something about the woman who'd gone quiet over an attendance sheet that afternoon. We met the summer I was 16, at the community pool where she worked the register and I worked the grounds crew, which meant I spent June skimming leaves out of the shallow end while she sold popsicles to 9-year-olds and read paperbacks with cracked spines during the slow hours. She had opinions about everything, which was new to me, growing up in a house where the safest thing to have was no opinions at all. She thought the deep end should be deeper. She thought anyone who complained about snack bar prices had clearly never had to run the register themselves. She told me, sitting on the edge of the empty diving well after closing one night in July, that I laughed like I was apologizing for it. And I didn't have an answer for that except to laugh again, quieter, like I was proving her right. By senior year, we had a whole geography of the town that belonged only to us. The church steps 2 streets from her house, where she'd wait with a paperback if I was running late. The overlook off Route 9, where the whole valley went orange at sunset if you didn't mind the mosquitoes. A booth at the Hollow Spoon, my Aunt Peg's diner, where Brooke did her homework and I did mine badly. And Peg kept refilling Brooke's coffee for free because, in her words, any girl who could get me to sit still through algebra for 2 hours had earned it. We had a plan too, the kind you make at 17 without knowing yet how little control you actually have over your own life. She was going to study education at the state college 40 minutes north. I was going to work construction with my uncle for a year, save up, and follow her there the fall after. We'd talked about an apartment with a fire escape you could sit on. We'd talked about her classroom someday, what she'd put on the walls. None of that plan came true the way we said it out loud on that overlook. All of it came true, 11 years later, in some crooked, unrecognizable shape, except I wasn't the one who got there with her. The night I left, I didn't call her. I want to say I tried and couldn't get through, because that's the version I told myself for the first year or two, back when I could still stand to think about it at all. The truth is smaller and uglier than that. My stepfather put my mother in the emergency room 4 days before graduation, and once she was steady enough to be moved, she'd already decided we weren't staying in the state long enough for him to find us again. And I agreed with her, and somewhere in the 2 hours it took to get her discharged, gather what we could carry, and load the Buick with its bad transmission, I made the decision that telling Brooke would only give Roy one more place to look. I told myself it was protecting her. For a long time, I actually believed that, the way you believe anything you need to believe in order to survive your own choices. It took most of a decade to admit the truer version, which is that I was 18 and terrified and ashamed of exactly what kind of house I'd grown up in. And it felt easier to disappear as a mystery than to stay long enough to be understood as a boy who came from a place like that. I left a note, for whatever that's worth, which by that point in my life wasn't much. I taped it inside the loose brick behind the church steps, the one we used as a mailbox for 2 years of birthday cards and apology notes, and one very bad poem I hope to God she never actually read. I don't know if she ever found it. I never went back to check. I never worked up the nerve to ask, not in 11 years, not even after my mother died 3 years ago, and there was suddenly nothing left stopping me from coming back to Cedar Hollow except my own cowardice, which turned out to be plenty on its own. I came back in June because my mother's house had been sitting empty since she passed, and Peg finally talked me into either fixing it up to sell or admitting I was never going to, and letting someone else deal with it. Sadie needed a change too, if I'm honest. Her mother and I split 2 years ago, mostly on account of things that were more my fault than Megan ever gave herself credit for admitting to. Megan and I share custody, and she'd agreed Sadie could spend the school year with me while we found out whether Cedar Hollow was going to stick, with breaks and long weekends worked out between us. Atlanta had been fine, not lonely exactly, just a life-sized for two that had shrunk down to fit one adult and one very opinionated 7-year-old, and neither of us minded the smaller space until Sadie started asking why our house didn't have any noise in it after 8 o'clock. I told myself Cedar Hollow was temporary. I had a standing offer to go back to my old lab job in Atlanta whenever I wanted it, and I told the district here I'd only sign on as a long-term substitute through the fall semester, filling in for a teacher out on leave, which gave me until the week before Christmas break to make it official one way or the other. Stay and sign a real contract. Go and let the house sell to whoever wanted a fixer-upper with good bones and a garage full of somebody else's memories. Peg thought the deadline was ridiculous. You're either home or you're not, baby. She told me the day I moved boxes into the garage, wiping her hands on the apron she wore even outside the diner like armor. A house isn't a layover. I told her I needed the exit clearly marked, same as I'd needed it in every room I'd walked into since I was a kid in Roy's house, and she gave me the look she'd been giving me for years, which said she thought that was about the saddest thing I'd said all week, and she might not have been wrong. I managed to avoid Cedar Hollow Elementary in person for 11 days after that first pickup line, which took more logistical effort than I want to admit, including asking Peg to cover 2 afternoons and telling Sadie I had a dentist appointment on a Tuesday I did not have a dentist appointment on. It ended on a Thursday night in September at Meet the Teacher, which Sadie had circled on the fridge calendar in red marker like it was a national holiday, and which I could not, in good conscience, find a way to skip. Cedar Hollow Elementary smelled exactly like it had when I went there myself. Pencil shavings and floor wax, and something faintly like tomato soup that never fully leaves a cafeteria, no matter how many years pass. Sadie pulled me down the hall by the hand, past a bulletin board of construction paper apples with kids' names on them, straight to a door with a laminated sign that read MS, Sutton's class, in bubble letters somebody had clearly cut out by hand. I stopped walking about 4 feet from the doorway. Sadie didn't notice for a full 3 seconds, still towing my arm, before she looked back at me like I'd turned into furniture. "Dad, come on." I followed her inside. The room was smaller than I remembered classrooms being. Low chairs stacked in colorful towers, a rug shaped like a world map, a fish tank on the windowsill with 2 goldfish labeled salt and pepper. At the far end, crouched to eye level with a kid showing off a drawing, was a woman with light brown hair pulled back and a pencil stuck through the knot of it, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, laughing at something the kid said with her whole face, the exact way I remembered her laughing at things that weren't even that funny, just because laughing was easier for her than not. She looked up before Sadie said anything. Instinct, maybe, or maybe 11 years hadn't changed my face as much as I liked to believe while shaving every morning. Her eyes found me across a room full of second graders and finger-painted suns, and everything about her went still for exactly as long as it takes a person to remember how to keep talking to a child mid-sentence. "And that," she told the kid in front of her, voice not missing a beat. Professional as anything. Is a beautiful son. Can I keep it on my desk? The kid beamed and ran off toward the fish tank, and Brooke stood up slowly, the way you stand when you're giving yourself extra seconds to decide what your face is going to do. Travis. Just my name. Not a question, not quite a greeting either. A fact she was confirming out loud, the same flat way Sadie had reported it to me 11 days earlier. Brooke. I hadn't planned anything beyond that, and standing in a room full of finger-painted suns, with my daughter's hand back in mine like an anchor, it turned out I didn't have anything else ready. Neither of us said anything else for a second. Sadie looked between us with the open curiosity of a kid who senses a story happening over her head and hasn't yet learned it's rude to ask about it directly. You two know each other. A long time ago. Brooke's voice caught on the word long in a way that carried more weight than the word usually gets to carry. Your dad and I grew up here together. Miss Sutton says I'm really good at raising my hand instead of shouting out, Sadie told her, unrelated, the way 7-year-olds pivot without warning. And Brooke crouched back down like the last 10 seconds hadn't happened and told her that was exactly right, and asked if she wanted to feed the fish before everyone else arrived. I stood there while my daughter got instructions on fish flakes from a woman I used to know every inch of, in a way that had nothing to do with fish flakes, or laminated bubble letters, or the life either of us was currently living, and I understood, standing in that doorway, that I had until Christmas to figure out what to do with the fact that I hadn't stopped loving her. I just stopped saying so out loud. Another set of parents came in behind us before either of us could say anything that mattered, something about a supply list and whether the school still did the Friday folder system. And Brooke's attention went where it needed to go, warm and professional and entirely out of reach for the rest of the night. I got Sadie home by 8. I didn't sleep much, again. October in Cedar Hollow means the whole town leans into fall, like it's a competitive sport. Every storefront on Main Street gets a scarecrow. The Hollow Spoon starts serving the squash soup Pegs made every October for as long as I can remember. And Cedar Hollow Elementary starts prepping for Harvest Night, an event I remembered mostly as free cider and losing the cakewalk to a girl named Katie Fenwick 4 years running. I found out I'd been volunteered for the parent committee the way I found out most things that fall, which is that Sadie told me after the fact, like she was reporting the weather. Miss Sutton's doing the game booths, and I said you'd help because you're really good at building things. I build exactly one thing, fences, and I haven't built one of those in 11 years either. You fixed the porch step. She had me there. I'd fixed the porch step the second week we moved in, mostly because Sadie tripped on it twice, and I couldn't stand hearing her yelp a third time. The committee met Tuesday evenings in the school library. 6 parents and Brooke and a stack of butcher paper nobody had a plan for yet. I sat 2 chairs down from her the first week, close enough to catch dry erase marker and something like vanilla underneath it that I remembered from a decade ago and hadn't expected to still recognize on contact. We didn't talk about anything that mattered. Ring toss versus beanbag toss, whether the dunk tank was worth the liability form, whether Coach Briggs could be talked into sitting in it again, which apparently he could, every year, because he liked the attention more than he minded the cold water. It was almost easy, sitting in a library on a Tuesday, cutting stencils out of butcher paper, pretending we were just 2 people who happened to grow up in the same small town, instead of 2 people who used to plan an entire imaginary life together 2 blocks from where we were currently sitting. The third week, we were the last 2 left at 8:40, stacking folding chairs because the custodian had already gone home and somebody had to. I hoisted a stack wrong, off balance, and she reached out without thinking and steadied it with one hand flat against the top chair, her arm brushing mine for maybe half a second. You always did that. Grabbed too many at once, so you wouldn't have to make 2 trips. efficient, reckless. She was almost smiling when she said it. The exact tilt of almost smile I used to spend whole summers trying to earn on purpose. You broke your toe doing that in Peg's storage room junior year. Told everyone you tripped. I did trip. Over the crate I was carrying, too many chairs to see around. She laughed, short and surprised, like it had gotten out before she'd decided to allow it. And then it was gone, replaced by something more careful, like she'd caught herself standing somewhere she hadn't meant to stand. She picked her bag up off the table. I should get going. Early morning. Brooke. Her name was out of my mouth before I'd decided to say it. She stopped at the door, not turning around right away. I'm not going to pretend the last 11 years didn't happen. I know I don't get to just show up in your classroom and act like nothing's owed. She turned around. Whatever had gone almost soft in her face a minute earlier was gone, replaced by something flatter and harder to read. You don't get to decide what's owed either, Travis. That's not up to you anymore. She left before I could answer, which was probably for the best, since I didn't have one ready. Harvest night landed on the last Friday of October, unseasonably warm all week, until the sky decided otherwise about an hour before doors opened. I was hauling the last folding table across the gravel lot when the first real drops hit, fat and cold and clearly not interested in waiting until 9. Brooke came out of the gym at a dead run, both arms full of paper lantern strings, calling for anybody who could hear her to start moving the game booths under the covered walkway before the cardboard turned to pulp. For about 11 minutes, there wasn't room in my head for 11 years of anything. There was just a ring toss booth that weighed more than it looked, and a beanbag stand somebody had anchored badly, and Brooke directing 4 parents and a 6th grader like she'd been running disaster relief her whole life, instead of a 2nd grade classroom. We ended up carrying the dunk tank frame together, one on each end. Brooke was soaked through by the time we got it under the overhang. I was only damp across the shoulders. Both of us were laughing anyway, for no good reason except the specific hysteria of being caught out and nearly out of options. Coach Briggs is going to be so disappointed. He had a whole speech planned. Tragic. You're barely even wet. She looked at me like it was an accusation, because I wasn't, not compared to her, because I'd spent the last 10 minutes angling myself between her and the worst of it, without noticing I was doing it. The same automatic thing I used to do walking her home in the rain when I was 17, and thought that was the entire job description of loving somebody. She noticed. I watched her notice, watched something in her face do the thing it had done in the library 3 weeks earlier, that careful retreat behind her own eyes. Old habit, I said, before she could ask, or before she could leave, whichever was about to happen first. You don't get to have old habits about me, Travis. Old habits are for people who stuck around long enough to earn them. It wasn't cruel, the way she said it. It was tired in a way that told me more than any accusation could have, that she'd spent a long time being angry and had mostly run out of the energy that takes, and what was left underneath it was closer to grief than anger. The rain kept harvest night mostly indoors that year, cider in paper cups instead of the usual crowd around a bonfire. And I spent the rest of the night watching her across a gymnasium, unable to close the distance and unwilling to pretend I didn't want to. Roy came back into my life on a Wednesday in November, the way bad weather does. Almost no warning and every bit of the damage you'd expect. Peg called me during my planning period, which she never did, and her voice had a flatness I recognized from exactly one other conversation, 11 years earlier, in a hospital hallway. He was at the Shell station on Route 9 this morning, asking Earl behind the counter whether you were living around here again. Earl didn't tell him anything, but Earl also called me the second Roy's truck pulled out, so I sat in my classroom after the bell with the lights off longer than I want to admit, running through a version of a plan I hadn't needed in over a decade, where Sadie was, who was picking her up, whether the house locks still worked the way they should. I texted Peg to grab Sadie from her after-school program instead of me, told her I'd explain later, and I sat with both hands flat on a lab table that smelled like old formaldehyde, trying to remember how to breathe like a person who wasn't 18 and hiding in a Buick anymore. I didn't see Brooke that day. I saw her the next morning at drop-off, and I must have looked like exactly what I was, because she took one look at me through my rolled-down window and didn't ask if I was fine, which was the first time in 11 years anybody in this town had skipped that particular lie. What happened? Not a question, really. She'd learned somewhere to read a person's face instead of trusting their words, same as I had. Can you come by tonight, after Sadie's asleep? It was out of me before I'd planned it, before I was sure I was ready. But some decisions get made by your body a few seconds before your mind agrees to them. She looked at me a long moment, the kind of look that used to mean she was deciding whether to trust something, and something in her face settled, like she'd made a decision she'd been circling for weeks. Okay, tonight. She came a little after 9, when the porch light was the only one still on, and the house had gone quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I made coffee neither of us drank. We sat on the porch steps instead of inside, the same kind of steps we used to sit on 2 streets over, and for a while neither of us said anything, just watched a truck pass on the road below and listened to it fade. Roy, that's who this is about. He's my stepfather. Was. I don't know what he is legally anymore. I stopped keeping track a long time ago. I turned my mug in both hands, not drinking it, just needing somewhere to put them. He hurt my mother, more than once, but there was one time bad enough that we left the state 4 days later without telling anyone where we were going. Brooke didn't say anything. She just watched me, the porch light catching the side of her face, waiting the way she used to wait, like she had all the time in the world, even when she didn't. I was going to tell you. I had it planned, some whole speech. I don't even remember what it said anymore. Then it was 2 in the morning, and my mother was crying in the passenger seat, with her arm still in the sling the hospital had given her, and I had maybe 10 minutes of that to pack my own duffel bag, and telling you felt like it would take longer than I had, or it would give him one more place to come looking. I told myself both of those things. I still don't know which one was actually true, and which one was just easier to believe. You left a note. Quiet. Not quite a question. I looked at her. How do you know about the note? I found it 6 years ago. Peg was having some brickwork done on the church steps, and called me because she recognized the handwriting on the outside of the fold, from all the birthday cards. Brooke's voice had gone very steady, the specific steadiness of somebody holding something with both hands so it doesn't shake. It said you were sorry. It said you'd explain everything someday. It didn't say where you were going or why, and I read it maybe 40 times looking for something in it that wasn't just an apology. And there wasn't one, so I spent 6 years angry at a folded piece of paper instead of a person, because the person wasn't around to be angry at. Peg never told me. It wasn't quite a question. I made her promise not to. If you were ever going to explain yourself, I wanted it to be because you chose to come back and say it, not because she pushed you into it. Brooke held my gaze steady on that. She kept her word for 6 years. I'm guessing that wasn't easy for her either. Something in my chest did something I didn't have a word for. Relief and a worse kind of guilt tangled together. Learning she'd found it after all. Learning that finding it hadn't been the small mercy I'd let myself imagine. All those years I told myself at least I left something behind. I'm sorry. It sounded exactly as small as every apology I'd practiced in my head and never gotten to say out loud. I'm sorry I made you spend 6 years angry at a note instead of getting the truth. I'm sorry I left you for 11 years without the truth at all. I'm sorry I let shame make the decision instead of trusting you enough to make it with me." Brooke was quiet a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped further, barely above the crickets in Peg's hedge 2 houses down. "I used to sit on those steps for a year after you left. Not every day. Just some days, when I couldn't stand not knowing. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I kept going anyway." She looked at me, and there wasn't anger in it anymore. Just a tired honesty that felt harder to survive than the anger had been. "I didn't need the whole story tonight, Travis. I needed to know you were finally willing to tell it, instead of deciding for both of us that I couldn't handle it. I know that now. Good, because I'm not 17 anymore, and neither are you, and I'm done being protected by people who don't ask me first." She didn't say anything else for a while after that. At some point, she reached over and put her hand over mine on the step between us, not holding exactly, just resting there, warm and steady, the same unhurried way she used to do everything that mattered. We sat like that until the porch light drew enough moths that she finally laughed, quiet, and said she should go before Peg sent out a search party, and I walked her to her car, and neither of us said anything about what came next, because some things don't need saying yet. They just need time to be true first. Roy showed up at the house a little over a week later, on a Saturday afternoon, while Sadie was at a birthday party across town, which I've since decided was the only mercy that whole autumn handed me on purpose. He looked smaller than I remembered, the way people who scared you as a kid have a habit of doing once you're finally taller than the fear was. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, not coming up them, like some old instinct told even him he wasn't welcome past that line. "Just want to talk. Heard you were back." "You need to leave, Roy. I'm not here to start anything. Your mother, don't." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to, which surprised me more than it seemed to surprise him. "You don't get to say her name on this porch. You don't get to ask me for anything. If I see you near this house again, or near my daughter's school, or anywhere Peg's diner is visible from, I'm calling the sheriff, and I won't feel 1 second of bad about it." He stood there a moment longer, working his jaw the way he used to when a room wasn't going the direction he wanted. Then he turned around and walked back to his truck, and I stood on that porch until the sound of his engine was completely gone, and I noticed, distantly, that my hands weren't shaking. For the first time in 11 years, standing in the exact spot I used to plan my exits from, I hadn't looked for a single one. I called the Atlanta lab that Monday and told them to take me off the list for January. I called the district the same afternoon and told them I wanted the real contract, not the substitute paperwork, if the position was still open in the spring. That week, I also called the realtor and took my mother's house off the market. Principal Doherty said she'd been hoping I'd ask, and mentioned that Sadie's teacher had actually put in a good word for me sometime in October, which was how I found out Brooke had gone to the principal's office on my behalf without ever mentioning it, back when we were still mostly just 2 people arguing about beanbag tosses in a library on Tuesday nights. I used to think the bravest thing a person could do was leave before they got hurt worse. It took 11 years and a 7-year-old with her father's stubbornness and her own flat way of stating the obvious to teach me it was the opposite. The brave thing is staying somewhere long enough to be known, scars and all, and trusting the people who stay to see you anyway. Brooke and I took it slow through the winter. Coffee after work at first, then dinners with Sadie folded in, then finally a first kiss on my porch in January that felt less like starting over than like coming home. By late May, Sadie was finishing out the year in Miss Sutton's class, already mourning the move to 3rd grade down the hall come fall, a prospect she considered a personal tragedy until she remembered that Brooke had been showing up for dinner 3 nights a week all winter. Sadie decided that arrangement beat a reading corner with real pillows by a wide margin. One evening in May, The three of us walked back from the hollow spoon after Peg force-fed us pie nobody had asked for, past the church on the way home. Sadie ran ahead to the steps the way she runs everywhere, all momentum and no particular destination in mind. Brooke slowed beside me, looking at the same brick I'd once folded a note behind, worn smoother now, some of it replaced during Peg's repairs, but the same steps, the same slope of shade from the same old oak. You ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't found it? The note. For all 11 years, actually. I just didn't know you'd spent the last 6 of them wondering about it too. She smiled at that, small and real, nothing careful about it anymore. I used to think I was waiting for an explanation. Turns out I was just waiting for you to come back and give me one in person. Sadie was crouched at the bottom step, examining something in the grass with the total focus she gives to anything that might be a bug. She looked up at us, squinting against the last of the sun. "Are you guys getting married?" Not really a question, more a status update she expected us to confirm, the same flat delivery she'd used the day she told me my teacher knows you, months before either of us was ready to hear it. Not yet. I said it to Sadie, but I was looking at Brooke when I said it. But I think that's where we're headed. Brooke's hand found mine on the sidewalk, the same unhurried way it had found me on the porch that night in November. So do I. Sadie weighed that with the seriousness of a kid deciding whether a fact was acceptable, decided it was, and went back to whatever she'd found in the grass. I stood there a moment longer on the same steps where I once used to sit, working out every possible way to leave this town, holding my daughter's teacher's hand instead, and staying exactly where I was,